So thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. Um, Nia, thank you for taking the time to present. Um, Nia Keith is a social justice educator and consultant with more than 15 years experience working in nonprofits, schools, and cultural institutions. She is also Mass Audubon's first Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice. Dedicated to cultivating equity and justice in all environments, Nia has spent her career motivating people to address environmental, social, and economic issues. As an educator, she designs and delivers interactive lessons for all ages to help people understand and take action to fight climate change. Nia holds a Bachelor of Arts in Women's Studies from The Ohio State University and a Master of Science in Environmental Studies from Antioch University, New England. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you so much for having me tonight. And thank you so much to everyone in the room who's participating in this conversation tonight. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And although there's going to be a lot of information that I'm going to be sharing, there's also going to be moments where I'm going to ask you to chime in, unmute, share your thoughts, use the chat. I'm really hoping that there's can be an interactive conversation. And there will be also points throughout the presentation where I will pause for Q&A. So don't be shy. I love having interaction with people. So feel free to be part of what's going on tonight. With all that said, I'm now going to share my screen so we can jump right in. And Stephanie, can you just give me a head nod if this is presenting proper? Perfect. Excellent. Here we go. So before we go any farther, I do want to pause and do an acknowledgement of land and history. So if people are not familiar with land acknowledgements, they've become much more common in mainstream culture in the last few years, but they are an indigenous practice of acknowledging connection to the land and the spirits and people's place in the world. And people now are using them very frequently to draw attention to indigenous rights and sovereignty. For the past 2 years since I've been, I guess it's almost going on 3 years now, time, what a construct. For the last 2.5 years or so, I've made it a practice to begin my climate justice presentations with a land acknowledgement. And I think it's important because it's not just a formal statement that recognizes and respects indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land, but also as it acknowledges the contemporary relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and the ancestral land. But it's also a way of raising awareness around indigenous sovereignty and land rights. So I want to stand here and acknowledge that I am occupying the traditional, contemporary, and unceded land of the Pennacook people, and we now call this place that I occupy Andover. But acknowledgement is not enough, as I have been told by many indigenous people who have been kind enough to share their thoughts and lived experience with me. And I have recently spoken with someone who said, like, it's wonderful that you do acknowledgements, but what about tangible support for indigenous work? And so one of the things I've committed to go beyond acknowledgement is to put money towards the work that indigenous people are doing to steward the land. So to that end, I will be donating half of the speaker's fee that I get for tonight's presentation to the Native Land Conservancy. And for anyone who is unfamiliar with the Native Land Conservancy, they are the first and only Native-run conservation group east of the Mississippi. Their goal is to protect sacred spaces, habitat, and other essential ecosystem resources to benefit Mother Earth and all human beings. And if you're interested in supporting indigenous land rights and conservation, you can learn more about the Native Land Conservancy at nativelandconservancy.org. Alrighty, so now our first moment for y'all to interact. I'm gonna ask for you to use the chat And looking at these pictures, which are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, in the chat, I would like you to say which picture best describes how you currently feel when you think of climate change. So go ahead and drop in the chat 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And if you're feeling a combination, you can put in more than one number as well. But what picture best describes how you feel about climate change? And then Stephanie, maybe you can tell me what's bubbling up in the chat. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Of course. So we've got a 2 and 5, another 2 and 5, a 1, 3, and 5, a 1 and 5, and a 5.
All right. Awesome. So obviously, or maybe it's not obvious because it's a picture, so there's a lot of implied emotion, but the pictures with the ostrich and the person carrying the world on their shoulders, and then this very classic Scream image is really depicting a lot of energy that people have when climate change information feels overwhelming and people are just like, I can't deal with this right now. Or the other extreme of like, I feel so responsible for doing everything. And then some people simply just feel paralyzed with the terror. My hope is that part of the goal of this workshop tonight is not just to look at the way climate change is disproportionately impacting certain populations, but also to empower all of you to go from any of these feelings that you might be having to these feelings, so that we can walk away feeling like we have agency, we're curious, want to know more, and want to grow together, but we are feeling like empowered to create change. So moving into the tofu of the presentation, I want to show you this climate change definition that I worked up with a team of mine a couple of years ago now. And this definition is a little bit different than ones that I had seen earlier on in my career, which is why I took it upon myself to write it. So I'm going to read it out loud for people who might want to take the information in orally, but it's also written here on the screen. So my definition of climate change is a rapid change in global climate patterns, which is threatening the sustainability of human and natural systems caused by human activities that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The effects of climate change can be mitigated through large-scale actions and policies that support nature-based climate solutions, reduce or eliminate greenhouse gases, and address social and economic disparities. So what I would like to know from y'all, again, another opportunity to interact, and this time you can use the chat, or I also invite you to unmute and speak if you'd like to, but I would like to know, what is it that is different about this definition of climate change than other definitions you may run across every day, other than the fact that it's very, very long? What are some of the differences between this definition and others?
I would say that I often think of climate change as not as rapid, but something that's happening slowly, although now it seems like it's happening more quickly, but I don't think rapid. Yeah.
Thank you.
We had in the chat, we had Keith said social and economic disparities is included as part of the problem. And Katie had said you offer solutions. Some people don't address how the economy drives climate change.
Y'all hit all of them on the head. I don't even need to like run any more of this presentation. Y'all have it all. Yeah, so you'll notice there's a lot of things about this one that is different than others. Like the rapidness is definitely an important aspect that I saw missing in a lot of conversations about climate change. And in fact, there is a lot of misperceptions that we have time because it's happening slowly, but it's definitely not. From from a geologic standpoint, from a climate standpoint, what's happening right now is extraordinarily fast. Of course, I have to point out that it's this human activities are causing it for anyone who might still be doubting. that this is like it's caused by humans. But yeah, someone in the audience today pointed out that mitigating like solutions. I think it is critical that when we talk about climate change, we don't just focus on impacts, which can be very dire. That focus on doom and gloom can often leave people with that feeling of like the ostrich head in the sand or the burdened earth. We have to talk about what are the solutions, because there are solutions. And I think it is one of the biggest misconceptions of climate change conversations is that people think there's nothing we can do about what's happening. And we absolutely can do things. And there are people who are advocating for and even actively engaging in solutions right now. And then, of course, at the heart of what we're going to be looking at tonight is addressing these social and economic disparities that have led to the climate crisis and are also part of the solution to the situation. So we will be talking about climate change impacts a lot during the first half of this conversation. So even though I'm like, yes, solutions, we are going to talk about some impacts because we're here to understand the fact that even though impacts of climate change are being felt everywhere, not everyone experiences those impacts proportionately. And some communities are impacted more than others. And the really unfortunate thing is that the communities that have historically been the most oppressed or marginalized by the economic issues and the societal issues that we were talking about a moment ago are also the same communities that find themselves at the heart of the worst effects of environmental harm and degradation, including the global breakdown of the environment that is climate change. And so when I talk about impacts that are happening to groups of people, this is not an accident. There is a systemic oppression that has been designed to uphold a global capitalist economy that was built by and still depends on extraction and exploitation of natural resources and people. So right now, we have an economy that can only survive if it's constantly expanding. And by doing that, we have to push nature beyond her limits, and we have to push people beyond their limits, and both suffer. And the other part that is really, really sad is that, again, the people who often are exploited by the system are often forced to live in the parts of nature that have also been the most exploited and oppressed. And so what happens to the planet is that we wind up with areas of the earth that become sacrifice zones. These are places where the waste and the pollution of this extractive economy is concentrated. And oftentimes we turn a blind eye to these sacrifice zones because in the back of our minds, whether we say it out loud or not, we have made this kind of cultural agreement that sacrificing certain parts of nature is just necessary evil in order to have the economy that we're living in. In order to have our modern society, there has to be some sacrifices. But something that we also tend not to look at is that when we are letting certain parts of nature become sacrificed to this, people are usually tied to that land as well. So not only do we determine that some places in nature are worth the sacrifice, we also often determine that certain people are worth the sacrifice. When we think about how people are often thrown away into sacrifice zones, it helps to look at what the terminology of frontline and fence line communities. A lot of people living closest to the sources of climate change pollutants live in one of these two communities. So a frontline community are those that experience the first and worst consequences of climate change. These neighborhoods often lack basic infrastructure to support them, and they'll be increasingly vulnerable as our climate deteriorates. So, for example, a frontline community would be a community that has been stripped of its green space, stripped of its tree canopy, paved over. And what has happened is that now that nature not being there to provide its services, you have a heat island where you have temperatures in this space that are 6-7 degrees hotter than the outlining spaces. And as the environment continues to change, as the climate continues to change and temperatures continue to rise, the people stuck in these heat islands are going to continue to suffer sooner and disproportionately. So that's what I mean by first and worst. So that is an example of like a front line community. A fence line community is a neighborhood that is immediately adjacent to a polluting company, and that community is directly affected by the noises, odors, chemical emissions, traffic, parking, like just the daily operations of that business. And the effects of being exposed to such pollutants are exacerbated by climate change. So for example, living next to like a distribution center, like an Amazon distribution center, where you have massive engines that are running all day long, 24 hours a day, with large trucks coming in and out, there's going to be a large concentration of pollutants in the air. And a fence line community that is right next to that means that those people are going to be dealing with that added heat, are going to be probably dealing with respiratory illness. And as the climate changes and temperatures rise, people with illnesses like respiratory illnesses are going to find themselves even sicker, struggling more for breath. So you have this like fence line community pollutant exacerbated by climate change. And the people who often are living in these fence line and frontline communities tend to more often be people of color. And the reason behind this is because a long time ago, when capitalism was really taking its global roots, there had to be a mechanism to be created that would divide people from each other and from the planet so that there could be a few people who could concentrate wealth. Otherwise, how do you ever get so many people to buy in to this level of exploitation? Racism was one of the levers that was used to divide people from each other. If we could create a false narrative that this person was different, this person doesn't understand you, this person is not worth as much as you, then we turn our eye when things happen. We segregate ourselves into false groupings and we let things happen. We let things happen to people, we let things happen to the planet. But in the end, regardless of what bucket of race we've been put in, we're all losing, and the planet is too. Unfortunately, though, because race has been a lever that has been used, people who are being disproportionately affected by these conditions first and worse are typically people who are people of color. But race is not the only factor that can actually impact whether or not a person is more likely to be impacted by climate change first. Other identities are also at larger risk, are populations that are considered to be more vulnerable. And that includes women and gender nonconforming people. It includes people with disabilities, youth and children, and the elderly. And lastly, people living in disinvested communities. So over the next few slides, we're going to take a quick rapid snapshot and look at each of these different identities. And then we're going to take a deep breath, pause, do a quick Q&A, and then we'll move to the second half where we'll talk about some solutions. So let's continue talking about race here, because like I said, this is kind of like the first lever that was used in this system. Through practices such as redlining and other forms of systemic oppression, people of color are forced to live in communities that bear the brunt of environmental harm. In fact, working class families and people of color face what they call triple unequal exposure effect, and to toxins and pollutants and other environmental hazards. And so this comes in the form of what fence line communities experience living adjacent to the pollutants, but it also comes because of other intersectional issues like class, that people of color not only are living in communities that the environment is affected, but also are affected in ways where they might not have class standing, economic standing to be able to afford healthcare. On top of it, because a lot of the jobs that are attached to these toxic spaces are often go to people who are being disproportionately affected, it means that they're most likely working in this place. So they're most likely living in a neighborhood that is being disproportionately impacted, maybe working there, so they're exposed all day long, and may not have the financial means to be able to take care of themselves with proper health care. Those are like the triple unequal exposure effect that has been identified. And this is, like I said, because of hundreds of years of systemic decisions that have quartered people of color in particular into these types of jobs and neighborhoods. Let's talk about gender real quick. In the United States and globally, women are much more likely to be victims of poverty than men. So this means that they're more likely to live in communities with fewer resources and older infrastructure. They are less likely to have access to healthcare. And all of this means that in the event of a climate disaster, women are more likely to die. And in fact, statistics show that women are 14 times more likely to die during a climate disaster than men. Every time I read that statistic out loud, I always pause because it's overwhelming to me to think that one aspect of a person's identity could have that much impact on whether or not they could survive a climate disaster. But gender affects people's survival in other ways too. So women are more likely to experience violence during displacement or in emergency situations. So if there is, let's say, a flood and people have to evacuate, women are more likely to experience violence when they leave their home. So not only are they running for their lives from a natural disaster, but now they may be facing human impacts of trauma as well. Connected to that, transgender people and gender nonconforming people are 7 times more likely to experience violence in the hands of law enforcement. So in this case, you have people who are trying to survive a climate disaster, and they have a heightened chance that the very people who are supposed to be helping to bring them to safety might actually do violence to them. All of this means that gender can have a really dramatic impact on whether or not people survive a climate disaster, meaning that climate change is definitely impacting these people differently. When we're talking about ability, we're looking at a broad spectrum of different human experiences. This could include cognitive ability, physical ability. It could also include experiences of trauma. And all of those things can affect whether or not a person can avoid, adapt, or recover from climate change impacts. So for example, a person who is physically disabled may find it difficult to evacuate an area or locate a shelter that can accommodate their physical needs, which leaves them vulnerable to impacts. In fact, there has already been instances where people have been evacuated because of flooding, and people who were reliant on certain hospital equipment simply were left behind. If a person with cognitive disabilities may not be able to sufficiently plan for a climate emergency or may have difficulties responding to the event in a timely manner, and that can reduce their survival. And then a person who has experienced trauma or suffering from some other mental illness may not have the coping mechanisms to make appropriate decisions in the face of a crisis. This is a bigger problem than most people know when it comes to climate crisis planning. Oftentimes, people with disability are not included in the planning, which means that when people are thinking about how to respond and how to rescue members of a community, they aren't thinking about it through a lens of disability justice. They're not thinking of the accommodations that people who have different able bodies will need in order to survive, which greatly reduces those people's abilities to get out of a climate impacted area. Whether a person is on the older end of a spectrum of age or the much younger end of a spectrum of age, people on both ends of the spectrum find themselves with some unique experiences that can cause climate change impacts to be exacerbated. For small children, they're very vulnerable to climate change and environmental pollutants for a lot of reasons. So for one thing, they do have these like small little bodies, which means that if they're exposed to toxins, those things can build up in them quickly, making them ill. It can also cause long-term health issues throughout their life if it comes during a time when their body is still developing. Also, like women, children are more likely to be affected by poverty, which reduces their access to healthcare, education, and other resources that usually determine their proximity to environmental hazards. As you can see, all of this kind of like stacks on top of each other, right? For older people, climate change impacts could look a little bit differently. So sometimes as people get older, immune systems break down. That can lead to serious illness that can be exacerbated by climate change, like I was saying with the heat island effect. But also a lot of times as people age, their bodies may lack a certain amount of mobility that they had when they were younger, or they might find themselves being cognitively impaired, which again goes to some of those issues I brought up when talking about ability. Additionally, many elderly people in our country find themselves socially isolated. And so during a disaster, people may find themselves without the social networks they need to get the support to survive the event, to evacuate, or they might find themselves without the emotional support they need afterwards, even if they are able to get out of the immediate threat zone. I also want to talk a bit about class. In the earlier slide, I made a comment about disinvested communities. And this term disinvested to me is very important. In the United States, we use a lot of words to talk about the amount of money a person has access to. We talk about class, low income, poverty, but I actually really prefer the term disinvested because it speaks to the very deliberate decisions that have been made over time not to invest in certain cities and places and to invest in other ones. And those things are connected to all these other kind of identities that I mentioned before, but very much connected to race in particular. And so what you have are communities that not only have been historically disenfranchised because money was not put in to build the infrastructure or to provide them with resources, but even after a disaster strikes, those communities are not given the resources to rebound. A really sad but poignant example of that is in this picture here. This picture was taken in New Orleans, Lower Ninth Ward, 16 years after Hurricane Katrina, and no one has invested the money to rebuild that community. So when we're talking about climate change impacts, we really are talking about a complex overlapping of identities. As you could see from all the examples that I shared with you, it was never just one factor of like, oh, if you're Black, things are bad for you. It always came down to overlapping, intersecting issues of race, gender, education, all balled up. And there are some factors that are more likely to influence what happens to a person, like race. Race has been shown to actually be to be an influence on survival and quality of life in every like marker that people have gone and researched, but it's not the only thing. It's really important that we understand intersectionality. And some people have maybe heard this term before. It's become more common for people to use it, but it was actually coined in 1989 by civil rights advocate and lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw. And she was trying to describe the overlapping ways that identities create particular experiences of oppression. And so her definition, or the definition that is in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So when we are thinking about climate action, I think it's important that we think about addressing the impacts of climate change through a lens of intersectionality. And we always have to remember that the roots of environmental exploitation are also tied, intertwined with the roots of human exploitation. We can't have environmental exploitation without exploiting humans. And so if we want to solve the environmental crisis, we also need to solve the human crisis. And traditionally, the environmental movement has often ignored or sidelined the needs of people with marginalized identities. But I really make it a part of my job to center those voices in the climate fight, because I truly believe that if there's no climate justice, there's no real climate action. So I just chatted at y'all a lot. Like that was like 27 minutes of me just talking. So now I want to just take a pause and ask y'all what is bubbling up after all of that. This can be questions people have, comments, like things that are thought-provoking for them right now. And feel free to use the chat, or come off mute and speak to the crew.
We have one comment, healthy outrage is bubbling up.
I like that. Healthy outrage. I've never
Mhm.
heard that exactly put that way, but I like it. Healthy outrage is bubbling up.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I think it's important that we have that. Hang on to the outrage, and then we're going to channel it into problem solving in the next few slides. Anything else bubbling up for people? Or anyone have questions about anything that I shared?
Thinking about the importance of intersectionality in response planning.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I could do a whole like presentation just on response planning and the need to think intersectionally and to center marginalized voices. Because if the people most impacted aren't actually at the heart of designing the plans, then most likely they're going to be left out, because people don't have the lived experience or the lens to speak for or plan for them.
Mhm.
So yes, thinking about that is a really important. Anything else? All righty. There'll be more time at the end. I'm going to go on to our next slide. So let's talk solutions. This is actually my favorite part. So there are lots of different kinds of actions that we can take to address climate change, but the goal should always be the same, and that is to help us reach a state of drawdown. And I love talking about drawdown because oftentimes when I talk to people about climate change, they haven't heard about drawdown. And I'm like, this is the best kept climate secret. What is drawdown, you might be thinking? Well, according to Project Drawdown, which is a leading source in environmental change solutions, drawdown is the future point in time when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. Yes, you heard me right. There are steps we could take to actually bring some of this back. We can turn this back some. This is the point when we begin the process of stopping further climate change and averting potential catastrophic warming. It's a critical turning point for the Earth, according to Project Drawdown. So how do we get to drawdown? There are three things that we must do to get to a state of drawdown. One, we have to think about supporting and protecting nature. So through natural, biological, and chemical processes, plants, soils, oceans, they naturally remove carbon from the atmosphere and they store it. This is called carbon sequestration. So when we protect nature and even restore natural systems that have been degraded, we allow the earth to heal through processes that she already does on her own. But we have to give her a little bit more time. And that gives us to number two. We have to eliminate the greenhouse gas emissions or drastically reduce them, if complete elimination is not possible. If we keep on pumping out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at the rate that we are, then it doesn't matter how many trees we plant, nature won't be able to keep up with what we're doing. So we have got to eliminate or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are ways for us to eliminate them, but there might be some sources that we can't. For example, methane from cows. We can reduce the amount of cows by changing the kinds of our agricultural practice, but I, for one, would never advocate for the eradication of cows, which means they will always be at least a small source of a greenhouse gas. But compared to what humans are doing when it turns to like burning coal for electricity and other points, that's definitely not the greatest of our worries. We can eliminate the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, looping back into this climate justice thing, we have to create a just and equitable society. I know, so simple. We're just going to create a just and equitable society. But that's really important. We have to actually think about the fact that we're in this pickle because we're dependent on an extractive and exploitative economy. So if we don't address the social inequities that allow that exploitative economy to run, then it will continue to do what it does, exploiting the planet, stripping the environment, and producing greenhouse gases. So we have to address the social issues. So what I'm going to share with you right now are two movements that are active and, in my opinion, super inspiring right now in the United States. And some of these have global connections as well, that are not only addressing the social issues, but are having important implications on climate impacts as well. So this first one that I'm going to talk about is the Black Farmers Movement. So a lot of people don't realize that after the Civil War and before the era of Jim Crow, there actually was a rising Black middle and upper middle class in the United States. The majority of this Black middle and upper class owned land, and it was a source of land for Black people. And 80%, in fact, of this class owned farms. But what happened during the era of Jim Crow is that this land was stripped away from Black people. And now there are estimates, conservative estimates, that says that the farmland that was lost between 1910 and 1970 is worth over $300 billion today. So that's also just a vast amount of generational wealth that has been lost. But on top of that, losing control over the land also meant that Black people lost control of being able to utilize farming techniques that had been utilized by Black people for many generations, and also a connection to having sovereignty over growing their own food. And so now you have this active Black farmers movement. And it's more than just Black folk at the core of this. There is BIPOC folk who are involved. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, but it really has been driven by a large Black contingency. And the Black farmer movement focuses on using sustainable farming methods, often derived from traditional practices. They often focus on transforming highly impacted spaces into arable farmland. And you have organizations like the Soulfire Farm, which was started by Leah Penniman, whose book cover is on the slide. And they run workshops year round, training people on these sustainable farming methods and also on methods of community sustainability and ways of helping people come together and thrive. Through these methods, they are creating acres of topsoil, and this cools ambient temperatures, reduce flooding, and also traps greenhouse gases. And it's addressing the societal economic issue of people of color and people living in disinvested communities being empowered to be able to feed themselves with their own source of food. So if you go back to that slide that I was saying about like the 3 ways we can get to drawdown, you can see that the Black Farmers Movement actually touches on all 3 of those things. It's supporting and protecting nature by building topsoil and transforming gray space into green space. It's reducing greenhouse gas emissions by using sustainable farming methods, and it's creating a more equitable society by increasing BIPOC access to healthy land and food. Check, check, check. It is possible that one movement can do all 3 things to help us get to drawdown. Second movement I want to highlight here is the Sunrise Movement. If any of y'all have been in the climate action space for a while, or if you have young climate activists in your life, then you've probably heard of Sunrise because they are big movers and shakers in climate action. It is a youth-led climate movement that its goal is to stop climate change and create millions of good-paying jobs in the process. One of the things I love about Sunrise is the fact that they are built from the ground up, that this is not just an environmental movement, but this is an economic movement. They take, excuse me, they like to take political action to demonstrate, educate, and communicate about climate change. They also openly stand in solidarity with BIPOC liberation movements like the Movement for Black Lives. And for those of you who have heard of the Green New Deal, they are co-writers and champions of that legislation. So how's the Sunrise Movement helping us get to drawdown? Well, they support the election of politicians that are advocating for the protection of land and trying to advance nature-based climate solutions. They also are advocating for a green economy that is independent from fossil fuels that release emissions. And lastly, they are working to push for a just transition away from an extractive and exploitative economic regime into a green economy. So I find Sunrise and the Black Farmers Movement to be super inspiring, and maybe you do too, but maybe you're also sitting there going, this is real great and everything, Keith, but like, I'm not a youth or I'm not a Black farmer. What can I do in my space to make a difference? So let's talk about that. So the way I think about climate action, I think about it falling on a spectrum of involvement in activities, ranging from actions that can be taken immediately and primarily on an individual scale to ones that are more complicated, more committed, takes more time commitment, and are part of more of a collective engagement. Ultimately, we really do need to be moving everyone in our society towards the collective engagement in climate action so that we can push for systemic change that will mitigate climate change and change the economic system that we spoke of later. However, I understand that everyone's journey is different and people can start at different points along the spectrum. So I'm going to break this down into 3 different levels of climate action and give you some examples of ways that you can get involved at any of those levels. So climate action level number 1. We all have to start somewhere, and at level of engagement, we're focusing on things like educating ourselves, raising the awareness in ourselves and people in our immediate circles, like social circles and networks, and also spreading the word about climate justice. A lot of people, even if they have been talking about climate change, may not be talking about climate justice. And so raising awareness around that is really important. So having a conversation about climate change may not seem like a really big step to you, but it's actually more impactful than you realize. Research shows that although a majority of people in the United States believe the climate crisis is real, that actually very few people have regular conversations about climate change. And so it's impossible for us to solve a problem if we're never talking about it. So educating yourself so that you can then lead conversations with your social networks is really an important step that we need everyone to take. And speaking of our networks, I encourage people to reach out to groups working on parallel issues that may not at their front look like a climate issue. But remember, the impacts of climate change happen intersectionally, and so do the solutions. So we might not think things like food security or public health or access to green space or transportation or clean energy are direct connections to climate change, but they all are part of this intersectional puzzle of climate impacts and social impacts. And so I encourage people to expand their networks by going and becoming part of conversations or organizations that are working in these parallel environmental spheres, and seeing if you can cross-pollinate ideas with people, find mutual support, and start spreading the conversation even wider. So now let's say you're ready to move on to level 2, okay? This is where things become more collective and more community-based. And these actions include joining a group that is organizing or advocating around climate change. It could mean hosting community-based events, lobbying your representatives, or organizing your neighborhood to collectively purchase renewable energy, compost, or increase energy efficiency. All of these things basically are like looking at not just how you interact with climate action, but how are you bringing your community along with you? Speaking of community, One thing that I often encourage people to do, because a lot of people are unaware of it, is to get involved with your local municipality. A lot of the different codes, regulations that impact our cities and towns that we live in are made at the super local level. They're not made at a state level or federal level. So getting involved with decisions in your local municipality is super important. And one way that you can do that is by becoming part of your town's municipal vulnerability preparedness plan. So Massachusetts is a super cool state in that I believe we are one of only two, and we are the first state that I know of that has done this, is to create a grant where towns and cities can ask for money from the state there's two stages. There's one grant that you can get money for doing an assessment, and you get to spend some time looking at where your community is climate vulnerable. And then a second grant is available to then help you put a plan into action to help bolster your climate resiliency of your town. The super cool thing about this is that anyone living in their municipality has the right to be involved with the planning and the implementation of their municipal vulnerability preparedness program. So you can go online to mass.gov/municipal vulnerability preparedness MVP program, and you can find out what your town's grant looks like, what their plan is if they already have one, what stage of implementation they're in, and you can get directly involved. So now level 3. At level 3 action, this is when people are usually getting way more public and way more demonstrative. Some of these actions might feel extreme to some people, but it's also the kinds of actions that tends to get widespread recognition and attention on the climate crisis. So these kinds of actions have their place. This includes things like organizing or participating in a protest or a rally or a mass strike, collective boycotts, but also one that I think is a little less demonstrative, but maybe might be the most important one, which is disinvesting from polluting companies and institutions. So when I talk about disinvestment, we all know that like large companies, they get the majority of their money because they are traded publicly. People buy stock, they put their money in that money that they get when people buy stock allows them to operate their business. It allows them to grow, to acquire resources. Without that influx of money, they wouldn't be able to do business the way they do. A lot of people, without knowing it, are investing in these things through their retirement funds. One of the things that I did years ago was to make sure that none of my money in my retirement fund is going into fossil fuel companies. And anybody who has a retirement fund can ask that. But in addition, there's also been movements all across the country where people have been advocating to disinvest from fossil fuels at their schools and businesses as well. At Mass Audubon, we have already made the move to disinvest all of our endowments from fossil fuel companies so that we do not put money into that. And there's also been movements at colleges here in the state of Massachusetts that where students have been able to be successful in advocating to have their school divest from fossil fuels. So I encourage people to look into it. It's definitely not something everybody might feel that they can do, but it is something that can happen at an individual level that can have really big collective impacts. And then the last thing on this slide I mentioned is banking with green financial institutions. There are specific institutions out there that are banks that do not do business with fossil fuel companies. In fact, they purposely use their investment into socially responsible companies. And you can choose to bank with one of these green financial institutions as opposed to a more traditional one, which can also be a way that your money can go and do the work in the world that you're most interested in. So to wrap all this up, I just want to point out that getting to drawdown is going to take time, it's going to take determination, and it's important that we all find something to help us remain hopeful and stay in the fight. You know, everybody has to think about what is the thing that keeps them going in the climate fight. Maybe it's this deep connection you have to a certain really important natural space that's near you. Maybe it's looking at your grandchildren and thinking, I want them to have the same kind of connection with the kind of environment I grew up in. Or maybe it's just like, feeling like this is the right thing for me to do. Whatever it is, I'm like, hold on to it, focus on it. And when you find yourself thinking, oh, I'm in that moment where I've got the weight of the world on my shoulders, think about that thing that brings you joy and know that that is a form of climate resilience. And I will stop sharing and see if there are any comments or questions or anything here at the end. Thank you, Keith. I appreciate that. Anything that is coming up for people?
Keith, did you want to ask a question? I saw that you put up the hand raised icon, or did you want to comment? Katie
Oh
as
no,
well.
I was just expressing appreciation. This has been
Oh,
so
awesome.
enlightening for me personally.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I do see a couple of, now that I can see the chat,
Yep.
now that my presentation is down, I can see.
Yeah.
Do you have any book recommendations for further learning? Oh my goodness. It depends on what is it that what aspect of the work are you most interested in learning about? I will honestly say that I have a stored in my head lots and lots of books and resources for looking at impacts of race on the economy and on society, because that's my focus as a equity educator and worker. Not as many for like climate justice per se, although there are some. So this one's not specifically climate, but if you haven't read The Intersectional Environmentalist, that's a good one.
I'm taking notes because I buy nonfiction. So,
Oh, hey, y'all,
yay.
put your request in now. Yeah, so I'm writing it in the chat too. The Intersectional Environmentalist, which I think is Leah Thomas.
Can look for that.
Is a really cool one that is not specific to climate crisis, but is specific to looking at intersectionality and environmental justice. So I think so I think that people would like that one. It's okay. I'm enthusiastic about books too. I just love them. And I'm happy to try to I have like a list, but it's not in my head. And I can share that with Stephanie later and people can use that as a resource. Let's see. There was another, love the plug to get involved with the local MVPs. Yes. I actually, in my slide here, I have, give me 30 seconds, friends. I have the, what do you call that? The link for that. I'll put that in the chat for you. If people are interested in learning more about the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, follow that link. I have had a number of conservation commissioners tell me how happy they are that I share that link all the time. They're like, yes, people don't know that they could be involved. So local conservation, it's easier to get involved with than you think.
I have a question. When you were talking about disinvesting in fossil fuels and local banks, is there a way to find out, aside from just kind of coming out and asking, if your local bank, what they invest in, or finding out if they invest in fossil fuels?
Yeah, I'm sure there is a way to ask them like what their investment portfolio, like where they invest the money they have. But I will say, without sounding like a horrible cynic, but that in general, unless an institution says specifically that they're not, they are.
Right.
And the reason is because it is actually a extraordinarily stable investment. Fossil fuels, although there's always like dips in the economy, but like the energy industry is always going to pay out over time because of our dependence on it. And so unless an organization has made a specific decision not to support that, they all have it as part of their portfolio.
I see. Okay.
And I remember even when I first started with my own like baby steps in financial planning, and I went and talked to a financial planner, said, teach me about these things. I know nothing. She taught me about like diversifying your portfolio and the different industries, and energy was one of the number one things that she said everybody should have in their portfolio. And I had to make the decision to say, like, actually, I don't want that type of energy. So now she specifically puts it towards green energy in that sector for me. But it's just a given that that's what they do.
And I see that Keith had put in a link in the chat, mightydeposits.com, that links to environmentally friendly banks.
Whoop, whoop,
Awesome.
Yeah, a lot of people have no idea that there are environmentally like friendly banks, that there are green banks out there. So that's another thing I love to highlight is like, no, there are, like, you can make choices about where your money gets invested. Like, we don't have to put our money into these companies. We can make choices. Anything else?
I'll just say I'm really glad you brought up the point about how important it is just to have conversations about this. Because yeah, honestly, I have very few conversations ever about climate change, period, with people. But especially not about the more layered links to just overall, the need for climate justice. So that feels like something I can do. So thank you for planting that seed.
Yeah, thank you for planting it and watering it and nurturing it. Because I think it's, people often say to me, but like, what can I do? And I'm like, no, seriously, just talk to people. I'm not kidding you. It's so important. People don't do it. Like, I mean, I professionally work on climate issues, and I still rarely actually have conversations with my closest circles about climate change because people just don't want to talk about it. It's uncomfortable, but we're not talking about the problem. How can we solve the problem?
Any other questions or comments? Nia, if you have the time, send along more book recommendations. I know you had. I can definitely pass those on.
Yeah.
And purchase.
Yeah, I have a short list somewhere else because other libraries have asked for it. So I know I have it. I just have to like dig it up. And it's like a smattering of environmental stuff, but also more looking at some of the social justice pieces that people are just unfamiliar with, and some of the environmental justice stuff too. Like the book that I put on the slide, Leah Penniman's book, Farming While Black. So good.
Definitely want to get that one.
Also, if people are familiar with, there's an online speaker series called Belonging and Out on Belonging. It's called On Belonging Speaker Series. Mass Audubon and 6 other organizations have been running the speaker series for the past 3 years. And Leah Penniman is going to be speaking, I think, next month or maybe later this month. And it's a free presentation. So if people are interested at all in sustainable farming and like community engagement, Leah is great. And I can plot that in the chat for people too if they want to check out the series. It's really cool. Like I said, it's been happening for like the last 3 years. And there's always speakers talking about all different kinds of just what it means to be in nature in identities that are often not centered. So last year there was a really amazing indigenous leader who came and spoke to us about like traditional indigenous ways of looking at nature, which for me was like eye-opening. Like he was saying how in a lot of indigenous languages, there isn't even a word for nature because there's no distinction between humans and the environment. And I was just like, even just that, like, imagine how different the world would be if we didn't see a distinction between ourselves and the environment. This is mind blowing. Anyway, the speaker series is really good. I encourage people to check it out. It sounds like people are cool. All righty. Well, thank you so much for having me, Stephanie. Thank you so much
Yeah,
to everybody here for coming and joining us this evening.
thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much. I will send along those resources.
And I will pass them on to attendees.
Awesome. Have a good evening.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.